The last lecture for this week is devoted to the topic of surf music, music from Southern California during this period between 1960 and 1963. Surf music was a uniquely American kind of music that really spoke to the kind of good, clean Southern California fun of mostly middle-class white kids living close to the ocean, and most of the topics of surf music songs have to do either with surfing, cars, or girls. And if you come up with a tune that's got cars, girls, and surfing in it all together, you've just sort of you've hit the big one there. This surf music thing really comes out of a kind of a vocal tradition and also an instrumental tradition. So when we talk about surf music, we should talk about it in terms of two different kind of styles of surf music. We'll divide it into vocal styles and instrumental styles. I'll start with instrumental styles first, although the vocal styles are really much more influential in the history of rock music than the instrumental styles are. Still, the instrumental styles are important, especially among guitarists, and they've enjoyed certain various periods of resurgence in the time since the early 1960s. So let's start with your instrumental stuff. The most important guitarist in instrumental surf music is a guy by the name of Dick Dale. His group was called Dick Dale and the Deltones, and his big hit was a track called Miser Lou from 1962. Dick Dale really was a surfing guy. He tells the story about, he'd be out surfing, he'd come in, he'd towel down, he'd put on his Fender Stratocaster guitar, and they would do the gig. Dick Dale played left-handed. He played the guitar strung upside down, and he developed this really fast picking technique that he would use, very much like a kind of a Middle Eastern sort of stringed instrument. In fact, Miser Lou is derived from traditional music from the Middle East. And so this sort of whole approach of instrumental surf music, music that, no vocals there, just instrumental tracks, it's interesting in the history of popular music that I talk about that like it's some big exception to the rule. But in the first week, when we were talking about popular music, we talked about a whole area of popular music, the big bands, that was mostly instrumental music. It's just a measure of how far we've come from the era of the big bands in the 1940s, that when I tell you about a group like Dick Dale, I have to say it's exceptional because there was no singing. Of course, during the big band era, there were tons of hits that had no singing. But it really has become, popular music has really become a very much a singing style, certainly by this time. Other big instrumental hits in the surf style are the Chantays' Pipeline from 1963 and the song Wipeout by the Safaris from 1963. When I was a kid growing up, every drummer knew Wipeout, even if they weren't a very good drummer, and they would be happy to perform the drum solo from it on just about any object they could find using their hands or anything else. So Wipeout is the was at least the ultimate sort of drum solo song of its day. Other instrumental songs and instrumentalists that are important for us to take into consideration, somebody like Duane Eddy, whose Rabble Rouser from 1958 was an important instrumental hit, and Duane Eddy, with that sort of twangy style of his, really continued to have influence into the early 1960s. We should mention the Ventures from Seattle, Washington, a group whose a 1960 hit, Walk Don't Run, is a veritable classic of instrumental guitar music, and they were very famous during the 60s for their instrumental versions. I would say if there's one group that most Americans would have known that consistently had instrumental music on the radio during the 1960s, it would be the Ventures. They were very big in their day. And just to take a step outside our American perspective for a minute, in the UK, there was a group called the Shadows. Now, when we talk next week about the British invasion, we'll talk a little bit about the scene in the UK and the idea that there was a singer there by the name of Cliff Richard, who was sort of the British version of Elvis Presley in a lot of kinds of ways. His backing band was a group called the Shadows, who also issued tunes that sounded a lot like the Ventures, under their own name, simply as the Shadows, without Cliff Richard there to sing. And so a good example of that, if you want to try to find it on the internet or somewhere else, is a tune called Apache from 1960. So that's the story with instrumental music during this period. Let's now turn to vocal music, and primarily the music of the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean, but more the Beach Boys than Jan and Dean. Jan and Dean are important, but the Beach Boys are really at the center of that. And at the center of the Beach Boys is Brian Wilson. He really was the brains of the operation. Brian was the guy who was writing the music, arranging the harmonies, doing all that kind of stuff. He was the leader of the group. They're all gifted in certain kinds of ways, but he's the guy with the real gift, the guy with the gift of musical imagination and creativity. As I said before, songs about surfing, cars, and girls. Here are three early Beach Boys hits: Surfin' Safari, Surfin' USA, and Surfer Girl. There's no surfer car there, or car girl, but you get the idea. It's an awful lot about surfing. It's interesting because aside from brother Dennis Wilson, none of the rest of the Beach Boys were surfers. And Brian Wilson, like, least of all, writing song after song about surfing when, I'm not sure how much time he actually spent on the beach, not on the water, I mean on the beach at all. But nevertheless, unlike Dick Dale, who really was, one of the surfing crowd, Brian Wilson talked about surfing, but he really wasn't part of the surfing culture in that way. It's also interesting that Surfin' USA, I should say, is actually a rewrite of Chuck Berry's Sweet Little 16. And Chuck Berry, when he found out about this, he said, you're going to have to pay me. So even though the original singles came out, saying words and music by Brian Wilson, after Chuck Berry found out about it and came after the Beach Boys, every subsequent version you find of that song will say words and music by Brian Wilson and Chuck Berry. And Chuck Berry gets a piece of the publishing every time Sweet Little 16 is sold in whatever form that it's sold in. Tells you a little bit about the influences on the Beach Boys. There's a lot of the sort of chugging guitar that goes on in those surf tunes, but also there's a strong influence of jazz-oriented harmony singing. And Brian Wilson, always talked about, always still does, talk about the influence of the Four Freshmen, who were sort of a jazz-oriented, mainstream sort of adult contemporary kind of group from the 1960s, but always sang in this sort of rich vocal harmony, and that's really what he was trying to get the Beach Boys to do. Of course, there's the doo-wop tradition as well that figures into the Beach Boy vocal harmony sound, and there's also the girl group sound. Brian Wilson, a fantastic admirer of Phil Spector. He talks about the first time he heard the song "Be My Baby" while he was driving in his car, as so many people heard music for the first time driving in the car. Remember, I talked about Phil Spector in terms of mono, that car speaker trying to make that sound as big as possible. Anyway, Brian Wilson is hearing that song for the first time. He's so impressed by the tune, he has to pull the car over because he doesn't even want to focus on driving. He can't believe the fantastic sound of that tune. So anyway, a very strong influence there of girl group music, Phil Spector, jazz harmony from Four Freshmen, and chugging harmonies and rhythm from Chuck Berry that go together to make that surf sound that the Beach Boys specialized in. The other group that had some success with this is Jan and Dean. Initially, there was a lot of cooperation between the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean, but the record labels got in the middle of that and started to tell them not to sing on each other's records and that kind of thing. But they remained friendly, and they were all part of the same kind of musical community. If you want to look for one Jan and Dean song that really represents the kind of thing they do, I think the best one is a song called "Little Old Lady" from Pasadena, a number 4 hit from 1964. It's kind of a fun tune, some great singing, and very much. If you didn't know that it was a Beach Boys tune, you might think that in fact it was a Beach Boys tune. Well, so now we've come to the end of our survey of this music between 1960 and 1963, and very soon, in February of 1964, the Beatles are going to arrive at JFK in New York, and things are going to change in popular music in a very definite kind of way. So I would ask you to think as you consider these lectures, and as maybe you dig into some of the music and try to find some of the music that I've been talking about this week, do you think these early 1960s are kind of a dark ages for pop, when pop was taken over by cynical music industry types who didn't really care about the music, didn't really have much respect for it, and thought these kids will buy anything, and so turned out a really kind of second or third rate kind of product that really didn't have any of the edginess or excitement of the original music? Or was it a period where there was a fantastic amount of experimentation and ambition taking place in popular music, with sweet soul, the sophisticated harmonies of the Beach Boys, the sort of dedication to more serious-minded lyrics of folk music, all of these kinds of things sort of coming together to take pop music to another level from what it had been in 1950 to 1959. And that development forward was in some way obstructed by the arrival of the British invasion, the arrival of the Beatles, and the fact that at first the Beatles were really pretty much like 4 teen idols, except that they really could sing and they really could write their own music and they were fantastically charismatic, but in terms of imaging. So which do you think it is? Was it a dark ages or was it a golden era for pop? I'll let you decide, and I'll be back next week to talk to you about the British invasion.